The next phase of President Roosevelt's administration has come to be known as the Second New Deal, another wave of substantial changes. And that's what the next sequence of videos will explore. Mr. Snyder will give you an introduction to the Second New Deal, and then we'll spotlight the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and a number of programs launched by the WPA. A particularly interesting WPA program that's mentioned in the OpenStax textbook was financing a collection of oral histories from men and women who had been born into slavery. Though it is the 1930s, it is, of course, it's before my lifetime and before the lifetime of any of my students by far, and most of those who will be viewing the videos. It's not ancient history. This is the lifetime of my grandparents and the lifetime of people who are still with us today, at least as I record this in 2023. But there were elderly men and women at the time who had been slaves still alive. And so one of the WPA projects was to make recordings of these formerly enslaved people telling their stories. And so we'll have a spotlight on some of the oral histories from slaves that came out in the 1930s. We'll hear about the Wagner Act, and we'll hear about perhaps one of the darker moments in at least the beginning of the first half of Roosevelt's presidency. We talked about opposition to the New Deal, and the most effective opponents of the New Deal were seated on the Supreme Court, as Roosevelt found piece after piece of New Deal legislation, which passed Congress easily, overturned by the Supreme Court, which had a strong conservative majority, as they said piece after piece of New Deal legislation was unconstitutional. And so Roosevelt cooked up a scheme to increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court to 15, which would then allow him to pack the Supreme Court with like-minded people. Pragmatically, that would have made it smooth sailing for all the legislation he wanted to pass. But do you see an issue with that? Do you see an issue with checks and balances, and how it was important constitutionally to keep the Supreme Court independent of the presidency? Well, you'll hear more about the scheme from Dr. Adrian Ivan in this video, but you'll also learn that this was Roosevelt's greatest failure, that even the supporters of his policy could not bring themselves to support such a blatant power grab. So you'll hear about Roosevelt's failure at this point. After this, you'll be introduced to economist John Maynard Keynes, whose economic philosophy is very much in line with what Roosevelt was attempting to do in the New Deal. So you'll see a Cornell X video on the New Deal and John Maynard Keynes. You'll learn about the Fair Labor Standards Act, after which we'll hear, so the general scholarly consensus is that the New Deal wasn't perfect, it wasn't without issues, but it really was Roosevelt and the New Deal that brought us out of the Great Depression. That's the general scholarly consensus, but it is not it's not universally held. So you'll hear an alternate perspective from PragerU, which argues that the New Deal actually doesn't deserve all the credit it gets, and if anything, it kept us deeper in the Depression. I'm not sharing my own perspective on this, other than I think you'll find, like Aristotle says, that the truth is often found in the golden mean, found in the middle between extremes. Roosevelt's New Deal certainly gives the government far more power than it ever had before to impact daily American life, and certainly far more power over business. How much power, how strong should the federal government be? That's an ongoing question. It's an ongoing source of tension and disagreement, even to this day, in the arguments between U.S. American conservatives and U.S. American liberals. And it's a tension that is written into the Constitution. That same tension existed between different factions within the Founding Fathers. It's a tension that has always been with us. The fact of the matter is, there's no policy other than just the most fundamental basic moral issues like, okay, you shouldn't microwave babies. That's something that's going to be always and everywhere true. Anti-baby microwaving is going to be good policy no matter what the circumstances on the ground are. Fact of the matter is, most policies are not like that because circumstances change. Most of human history was spent as small roving bands of hunter-gatherers, and the kinds of policies that would work in a nomadic hunter-gatherer band, which is most of our experience as human beings, certainly would not work today, and the policies that work today would be meaningless or harmful to most people who have ever lived as hunter-gatherers. It could very well be the case that an emergency like the Great Depression requires extraordinary policies that in normal times may not work as well. It is complex, and it requires constant review and constant vigilance on the part of the American people. That's why education is so important. It requires constant vigilance on the part of the American people to say, even the best policies of yesterday, are they working today? That's why the debate is so healthy, but it requires U.S. Americans to be informed, educated, and awake. How strong should the central government be? A government with too little power cannot help the American people, and also cannot hurt the American people. A government with the power to help also has the power to oppress. That's why education and vigilance are so key. I can't solve it for you, and this class is not about my ideas anyway. Ask me if you know me. Ask me in private after you graduate what I actually think about politics today. At any rate, I've said enough. I'll be back with you after the PragerU video.